Welcome to Tea Book Club, a discussion on E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime. This event is presented by the House of Chanel.
Hello, I'm Hanya Yanagihara, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Tea Magazine. Thanks so much for joining us for the latest installment of Tea Book Club, for which we'll be looking at another New York City novel. This time, it's E.L. Doctorow's 1975 book, Ragtime, which takes place in the early years of the 20th century and weaves together narratives of seemingly disparate lives, many of them led by real-life historical figures. Leading tonight's discussion is the novelist Jonathan D. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and please visit teamagazine.com for more information on Doctorow and to sign up for future sessions of the Tea Book Club.
Good evening, and welcome to Tea Book Club. I'm Kate Guadagnino, a Tea contributor, and I'm so pleased to be here for the second episode in the second round of this series, for which we're focusing on New York City novels. Tonight, we'll be exploring E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, which was published in 1975 with the acclaimed writer Jonathan D. He is the author of 8 novels, including The Privileges, which was a finalist for the 2011 Pulitzer Prize, and, most recently, Sugar Street. After Jonathan's talk, I'll join him for a conversation and ask questions submitted by readers. If you have any additional questions or comments, please share them in the chat. And now I'm honored to introduce Jonathan D.
So I'm always a sucker for works of art that have a sort of Trojan horse quality that come in the guise of something kind of normie and traditional and familiar, but conceal a more original and sometimes a more subversive intent. The writer John Cheever had a great line about this, and he talked about the role of verisimilitude or realism in fiction. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said that if you could convince the reader that they were standing on a real rug, that you could then pull it out from under them. Ragtime is a classic in that genre, if it's a genre, because for me, one of the remarkable things about it is that it's so readable. It's so entertaining and comforting, even in many of its aspects, that it takes a while for it to kick in. Just how weird and audacious a production the whole book is. That's not to say that it didn't have any antecedents. It certainly didn't come from nowhere. One of those is Doctorow's own previous novel, The Book of Daniel, which was published in 1971, 4 years before Ragtime. And that was a book about a thinly disguised version of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the convicted atomic spies. And there, Doctorow's concern with not just big American themes, but American history, actual American history, in particular the history of injustice, was starting to take form. But crucially, he hadn't really broken the barrier yet of just calling the Rosenbergs. They were still that kind of traditional fictional fig leaf to disguise his creations from the real people. Another is John Dos Passos's trilogy of novels known collectively as U.S.A. It's the 42nd Parallel and 1919 and The Big Money, and that, which certainly, if you think of it as one work, which it definitely is, that certainly has to be on any short list of great American novels. But it was an inspiration for Doctorow because it had that hugely panoramic view of a particular period in American history, American society, just the biggest possible canvas, many perspectives. In his case, not just like New Rochelle and New York and the environment, but all over the world. And also, importantly, included real figures on the page, although not really in the fiction. In USA, a lot of the same people who appear in Ragtime, Henry Ford, J.P. It's obvious, is a novella by the great German writer Heinrich von Kleist, published in 1810, called Michael Kohlhaas. And this is a story of a man who meets with a kind of corrupt, low-level police officer who in his case, charges him a non-existent toll, and takes 2 of his horses as he crosses into Saxony. Michael Kohlhaas develops a lifelong obsession with redressing this injustice, and in effect, just goes to war, impossibly, with with not only the government but the royal family, and in the end gets what he wants, but also is executed in the process. So this should all sound pretty familiar to any reader of Ragtime. It's exactly, and really right down to the name, Michael Kohlhaas and Kohlhaas Walker. That's, Doctorow wasn't making any effort to conceal the story that he was retelling there. It's also worth mentioning that Kleist's Kohlhaas was based on a real person also named Kohlhaas, although it was spelled a little differently. So in a way, Kleist himself was a predecessor for the technique of drafting real-life people into fiction, but we'll talk more about that later. So Ragtime, one of the comforting guises that it comes in is just, it is in the end a work of historical fiction. It seems almost reductive to say that, but it's a work of historical fiction that fits, into that genre pretty neatly, in that it aims to reanimate a vanished way of living, far enough away from us that we might find it, quaint or even exotic, that we have a kind of safe distance from it. But then along with that, that reanimation, occasionally, as we're looking from our kind of God view in time at these people who lived long ago, occasionally they'll sort of look back at us, which is to say, we will see things in there that are actually frighteningly reminiscent of the way we still live, things that haven't changed at all. It's also very familiar in the sense that it has a kind of classic 19th century structure. There's a remote but authoritative narrative voice who omnisciently narrates the stories of people who are radically disconnected from each other. A kind of God view that's shared with the reader in a way that we're very much used to encountering from your Dickenses, your Stendhals, your Balzacs, etc. As I talked about a little in the essay, one of the big differences here is that it's not just about our being able to see everybody; it's the way everybody gets to see each other. But still, it feels, there's a kind of sort of, formally speaking, like a candy coating to the whole thing that makes that draws you into it instantly. Now. The last bit of it, which I'll just nerd out a little bit here and talk about style, because on the level of style, Doctorow is such a beautiful writer, and when we talk about somebody being a beautiful writer, very often that's associated with the long, complex, ornate sentences, in particular, complicated thoughts, artfully, and in some cases in a very stylized way. Rendered on the page, like a Garcia Marquez or Harry James, or indeed like Dos Passos, who Dos Passos had a style that was so mannered, and you could spot a Dos Passos sentence a mile away. Doctorow was different. His sentences, for the most part, are short and simple. And by simple, I mean in their grammatical sense, as in not compound. They don't have a lot of dependent clauses. They don't have a lot of punctuation even. It's just a lot of subject, verb, object, not always in that order. So why is that worth remarking on? I mean, I think it's, for one thing, it's one of the things that gives Ragtime its sense of not only kind of easy authority, of comfort or familiarity, but also of momentum, because it's very rare that you read a Doctorow sentence and think to yourself, I got to go back and read that again and make sure I got it right. The sentences are like 8 or 10 words long. You can keep going. And it might sound like a simple idea, but it takes a very skilled and confident writer to do that, and to do that with the sort of rhythmic sense that Doctorow had. It reminds me, too, of the great line from the Russian short story master Isak Babel, also a great master of the short sentence, who said, and this one I want to get right, no iron can stab the heart with such force as a period put at just the right place. And I think of that all the time in Doctorow. In fact, I'm going to seize the opportunity to read just a tiny bit to say what I'm talking about from the book. This is the very end of chapter 2, when Father is on board the Roosevelt, leaving the port of New York to go to on the polar expedition with Peary. And on his way out, he passes a ship of immigrants arriving in New York. And I'll just pronounce all the periods here. Her decks were packed with people, period. Thousands of male heads in derbies, period. Thousands of female heads covered with shawls, period. It was a rag ship with a million dark eyes staring at him, period. Father, a normally resolute person, suddenly foundered in his soul, period. A weird despair seized him, period. The wind came up, the sky had turned overcast, and the great ocean began to tumble and break upon itself as if made of slabs of granite and sliding terraces of slate. So there's one compound sentence just to keep you on your toes, right? Just so the pattern doesn't get too pronounced. He watched the ship till he could see it no longer, period. Yet aboard her were only more customers, for the immigrant population set great store by the American flag. So that's not only is that great, but when I read it, I think like a less, a moment of great emotional swell like that, a moment of great import, ending a chapter. A less confident writer, like for instance myself, would have made every one of those sentences 2 or 3 times longer. But to keep the beats coming the way he did is amazing. All right, so in the first part of the book, there are various story threads that progress for sure. There, Sarah and her baby come to live with the family in New Rochelle, and there's younger brother's pretty improbable relationship with Evelyn Nesbit, and Tatis throws his wife out, and then he and his daughter have to leave town, etc. But for the most part, the movement in that first half of the book is discursive. It's almost anecdotal. It's almost like it just whatever its attention lights on, it's just going to stay with for a little bit, even if that's just for the space of a chapter, or even just for like a paragraph or two, as with that very strange interlude with Theodore Dreiser trying to arrange his chair properly in his room by himself. Again, why is that in there? Just because it's in there. But then the fictional story of Coal House that coalesces about halfway through and winds up drafting everyone, fictional and quote unquote real characters alike, into its wake. Morgan, Booker T. Washington, etc., all become part of Coal House's story. So maybe right here is a good place to talk about something that I think eventually needs to be talked about with regard to Ragtime, even though it's obviously much, much less remarkable than it was in 1975. And that is just the practice of conscripting real people, people who lived, people who had an identity and a record and all that, conscripting them into a story that you're telling about, about made up people. And I mean, I guess the question is like, is there a sort of ethics to that? And I will say that this marks me totally in the literary critical world as an absolute reactionary to be talking about this at all. But I think that, yes, I mean, surely it does. It has to. And I mean, one way to measure it is that if in a case where this is done badly, and I won't mention any books, I certainly could, but probably you all have know what I'm talking about. Like where a book like this that doesn't do the job well, it's worse than just a bad book. I think it's a kind of violation of a sort. It is possible to respect the dead. It is possible to acknowledge what, even as a fiction writer, is impossible for you to know. So I only point that out just as a way of pointing out that Doctorow, I mean, he does a great job with this for a couple of reasons. One is that he announces the book as a fantasy right away. There's no question of it being a sort of documentary about Stanford White or whoever. Another is that it's quite, it seems quite heavily researched. I mean, it's very, it's not taking any great flights of fancy, with a couple of scenes accepted, I guess, but with any of these real life figures. Still, it's a book that changed American fiction completely in this regard, and lastingly, certainly to this day. I mean, it's what was revolutionary then is common now, and that changes both for better and for worse. I mean, I think the worst you could lay at Doctorow's feet is that he like Ernest Hemingway or like Raymond Carver, let's say. He spawned a lot of bad imitators. He made something very hard look very easy, and like something other people, lesser writers, could do. And that's not really his fault. So we'll just acknowledge that that's true, and then that's maybe the primary legacy artistically of Ragtime. But not his fault. All right, and I'll just say one more thing. Just acknowledge one final bit of weirdness and audacity in the novel that I haven't really talked about or written about. Although I understand that actually this figures more heavily into the Broadway musical version of Ragtime, which I have not seen. But the end of the first chapter, the end of that extraordinary first chapter, when Houdini is leaving the house in New Rochelle, and the little boy says goodbye to him. He doesn't say any of the things that you'd expect him to say. He doesn't say it was an honor to meet you. He doesn't say, can I have your autograph? Anything like that. He says, warn the Duke. Now, nothing is made of this. It takes a long time for this to pay off, in the book itself. And by the time it does pay off, so much else has happened that, one could be forgiven for having forgotten about it a little bit. But of course, what's happening there is that later in the book, Houdini on the other side of the ocean happens to meet Archduke Ferdinand, who's a bit of a dim bulb who somehow confuses Houdini for the inventor of the airplane. But anyway, Ferdinand was the one whose assassination led to World War I and to really arguably the end of much of the civilized world, the veneer of civilization that Ragtime is set in. So what are we to make of that? Like the little boy is a clairvoyant, maybe? I mean, he's maybe in his unique ability to kind of see across time, he's supposed to be a sort of stand-in for his author. I don't know. It's just, again, it's one more bit of kind of throwaway brazenness in a novel that refuses to settle for being any one thing. It refuses to settle for any one idea or fixed idea about itself or about its genre or anything like that. Doctorow, he wrote a lot of great books, but Ragtime was certainly his masterpiece, and its influence, as I say, on the American fiction that came after it would be really hard to overestimate. A lot of times when you read a book like that, when you go back and revisit something really influential, it seems a little less revolutionary by virtue of its own influence, but I didn't really find that this time with Ragtime. It's still, there were still any number of times when, my jaw would drop at the unusualness and the boldness alongside that easygoing, folksy envelope that it's in. Really, I was very happy to get the chance to re-engage with it and to celebrate it again.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that. You mentioned the little boy as a kind of prophet, and I'm wondering how he compares to the characters who wish they had spiritual powers, especially given all the talk of spiritual bankruptcy in the country and culture.
To me, the little boy figure he seems unique in the novel and meant to be unique. I can't say exactly why, but the one, the one figure in there who can do what we as the reader are doing, but what none of the other figures can do. I mean, there's a lot of talk about spiritual powers, etc. But I can't recall any others that are really forward looking, right? He's looking into the future. Other people are more concerned with maybe connecting with the dead and like that. But am I forgetting? Am I forgetting somebody who's got more of a kinship with it?
Evading their own death.
Or sorry?
Evading their own death.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also the suggestion that many of the unlikely encounters in the book are a kind of magic and comply with what Emma Goldman calls the mystical rule of all experience. So you touched on this a little, but what is the meaning of these fated meetings, and what do they allow Doctorow to do? Well,
I do love. I loved Emma Goldman's speech where she talks about how there is no Mexican Revolution. There's only one revolution. There's only one struggle. That all these disparate things, which seem very unlike each other, in fact, are exactly alike and are all one. And that's nice because it works great in the scene. I mean, it makes me want to go out into the street myself. It's very exhortatory, but it also fits the book, right? Which is that that as unlikely as it seems, these things are all connected, or eventually will be revealed to be connected. The idea that of it's being magic, I mean, it is magic. I mean, I think to me that's Doctorow acknowledging, slyly that what he's doing is he's not interested in a realistic portrayal of how, the details themselves are quite realistic and detailed, but the interactions of the characters in particular, there is a magic to them. It's an artistic magic, and it's just acknowledging that from inside the book instead of outside it.
What do you think we're meant to make of Tato's transformation from a struggling socialist to a comfortable member of the creative class? He seems to be one of the few characters who ends up better off than he started, and who becomes more invested in the American dream instead of less.
Yeah, it is funny that that's one of the reasons he's a great character, is that he succeeds beyond his wildest dreams, and in doing so, I think loses a little bit of the fervor with which he noticed, the injustice that informs that whole American dream idea to begin with. I love it that he sort of catches the wave of there's a sentence in the novel that I love again, because it's like a classic short Doctorow sentence, where he's talking about how the great thing about what Tato was doing is that it could be reproduced, and this is a big change in it's really about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. But what Doctorow says is the value of the duplicable was everywhere perceived. And so he becomes a kind of stand-in for that whole process. And in doing so, he becomes very happy and successful, and it's impossible not to root for him. But I think there's a part of you that also realizes that he was right when he was, when he was struggling and involved in the strike up in Massachusetts and all that stuff. Like, he was, it can be hard to hold on to that clear-eyed vision of social phenomena, economic phenomena, when you yourself are relieved of having to think about it every day.
Yeah, I thought it was telling that he ends up making money on a story about children of different backgrounds joining forces, sort of commercializing this rosy melting pot view of things.
Yeah.
And Doctorow seems to go out of his way to emphasize that's not what he's doing.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask about Coalhouse's transformation. How would you describe his journey or arc, I guess? And is there a point at which he goes from fighting for his own cause to fighting for something larger?
Well, to me, I mean, maybe this is, semantics, but to me, the great thing about Coalhouse is that he doesn't really transform. It's his consistency. It's people. The world transforms around him, but his demands stay the same. His methods, escalate. But he wants, even though he recognizes, certainly by the time you get to the scene where he is talking in Morgan's library with Booker T. Washington, he recognizes what his struggle is symbolic of. He still only he's not expanding his struggle. He just wants the car back. He wants the car back in its original condition, preferably repaired by Conklin himself, which is what he gets. So it's the force of his insistence on, not just on his own humanity, but on the idea of justice. Like, he's not going to give up on it, even though in the world he's living in, everyone encourages him to give up on it, including father. It's the force of his example that makes two things happen around him. One is that he attracts this coterie of revolutionary followers who see him as a kind of leader for them. The other is a kind of mirror reflection in white society, where people conceive of him as a kind of supervillain who they're constantly locking their doors because they're terrified he's going to show up. They're the ones doing the escalating there. Coalhouse just wants the car. But I mean, even just in artistic terms, it's a really cool thing to watch how Doctorow can build a plot around somebody who doesn't change, but the fact that he doesn't change makes everyone around him react more and more strongly.
There's also this very American idea that property is sacred, but only for some. You mentioned Booker T. Washington. How do you think Coalhouse's views differ from Washington's, and what is Doctorow's aim in pairing the two of them?
Well, I don't know. That's a tricky one to speculate about Doctorow's aim. I mean, I would modestly guess that one of the things going on there is that, as I said, any historical novel, part of what it's doing is showing us little, mirror shards to in which we can see ourselves in what we're still doing. Doctorow, old enough certainly to have lived through the worst years of the civil rights struggle, and the argument between Washington and Coalhouse, which is the argument in some ways between violence and nonviolence, or between trying to gain acceptance through conformity and trying to reject that idea wholesale. That's an argument that was and is still going on, and that would have been very much in Doctorow's head, I imagine, as a socially conscious man of his age.
Do you think younger brother's allegiance to Coalhouse and to various forms of revolution is sincere?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, well, I shouldn't say totally, because Doctorow's too good a writer for that. I mean, you can't, just as in real life, our motivations are never kind of one-to-one. It's not that this one thing makes us, change our life in this one way, or very, very rarely. I mean, because I do believe completely. I love younger brother's kind of denunciation of father at the very end of the book, and I believe he's completely sincere about it. At the same time, there's no way he could disconnect, and so there's no way that we could disconnect that feeling of rebellion from his feeling of rebellion against his own family and against the kind of constantly subservient position that he's kept in. I mean, he doesn't even, he's mother's younger brother. I mean, he's not living in his own house. There's a lot of resentment there. He's working for his brother-in-law. There's a lot of resentment there that can't be separated from his genuine feelings of wanting to support Coalhouse in his fight for justice. So yeah, I think there's no question that it's real, but that doesn't mean that there's only one thing going on there.
Right. I guess I saw it somewhat as an outlet for his heartbreak. And there's that line where Emma Goldman says, "Why can't you enjoy your freedom?" And to me, that seemed to be the moment where he decides to do something with his freedom. If it can't, if he can't have what he wants, he'll figure out an alternative.
Right.
I also wanted to ask about your sense of Doctorow's views on change and progress in history in general. As I read, I kept thinking back to it's pretty early in the book, Mother saying, "Yet I know these are the happy years, and ahead of us are only great disasters."
Yeah, also a great line. Well, I don't know. I think for Doctorow, he would have been, like all of us, you have a sort of double vision about that. On the one hand, things are changing so rapidly you can't possibly keep up, and it's hard even to kind of, lift your own gaze up and recognize what's happening. Technology drives so much of that, and that's a big part of the book too. And that will always be the case. That even in the most kind of simple or intimate corners of our lives, our routines, our habits, our emotions are going to be affected by changes in technology. So on the one hand, there's that incredibly rapid movement that art like this exists to kind of arrest, kind of make it stop for a second, and let's make sure we get a look at this before it's gone forever. On the other hand, as I say, he was, it's not as though he wrote about Coalhouse in order to explain to us that, long ago, Black people were discriminated against in America. He was very conscious of telling a tale that was still contemporary. Same with Emma Goldman. Same with the rich people on Fifth Avenue having parties. I mean, I think there's the sense on the ground of really rapid change, but then in a social sense, I think he was able to observe, with wryness and some despair, that a lot of the things that were awful for the marginalized, in this country in particular, are still awful when he was writing in the same way.
Does it strike you as a critique of the 1970s in particular, or more a testament to what never changes and the violence and hypocrisy baked into the American experiment?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, there's probably, he like anyone, he was, you're never really writing from outside of time. You're always writing from the time in which you're living and in which you feel moved to produce this art. So I'm sure, certainly the question of race, certainly the question of governmental corruption and wealth inequity, those things were plenty present in the 70s. So in that sense, it was a critique specifically of the 70s, but I feel more, at least when I read it now, I feel more like it's talking about American ideas, American mindsets that aren't tied to any one decade or even any one generation.
Mm-hmm. One other quote for you. I wanted to ask what you think Doctor means when he describes Father moments after his death as the immigrant, as in every moment of his life, arriving eternally on the shore of his self. Seems to hark back to that moment of the two ships passing. Yep,
exactly. I mean, I think it's a beautiful line on its own, just in the sense that I can think of other, great books, great works of art that are very much about that, about the sense of arriving at the end of your life, realizing that you've never really, felt like you understood even yourself. It's yet another instance of recursion, because it does hark back to not only that scene I read, but also just to the role of immigrants and the immigrant struggles throughout the book. But I think more than anything, it's just, the beautiful thing about it is exactly what you said, that it goes back to that paragraph. It goes back to that really brief scene, 250 pages earlier. And it makes that scene into a kind of mystical instance of Father foreseeing his own death, right? I mean, as he's going out into the world, as he's going out exploring what's passing him on the way back in, a ship full of immigrants. And so to then be directly equated with them at the literal end of his life, it makes that, the weird despair that he's feeling and the foundering in his soul, it gives all that a different vibe. All of a sudden, to think that was like a vision that he was having, whether he realized it or not.
All right, I wanted to leave some time for reader questions. So this is from N.Y.C of Florida. What do you think it means when Doctorow writes that across America, sex and death were barely distinguishable?
It's funny, the attitude in the novel toward sex and also toward gender and toward the roles of women, etc. That there's on the one hand, the equation of sex and death. I mean, it makes sex just seemed in that era, more apocalyptic. I don't really know how to say it. I mean, there's a bit in the very first paragraph too about there being a lot of sexual fainting. That somehow it wasn't casual. It was catastrophic. It was life changing. In some cases, it was life altering. I mean, look what almost happened. And in the end, I guess did happen to Sarah. Look at Mother and her relationship to her own body, to sex in particular. Though she does have a kind of progressive ending, I suppose, in that respect. On the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, Doctorow seems to indulge a little bit of nostalgia for that, almost. He actually says at one point that it was it was about a month before Freud came to America and ruined sex forever, which is a little bit tongue in cheek, but you can tell that he has an ambivalence about the dropping of the various veils of mystery, and even, I suppose, shame or embarrassment surrounding sex, and what that's led to.
Well, also Freud ruined being a huge fan of one's mother, or Houdini and others.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, this is from Elizabeth Edgerton of Massachusetts. Why does Doctorow withhold Kohlhaas's entrance for more than half the novel?
Ooh, that's a good question. And you know what? If Doctorow were here and I could ask him, I would ask him if I'm right in suspecting that he got that idea from Madame Bovary. I mean, I think I don't know if it's quite halfway through the book before we meet him. I think he appears, but he appears, just as just as part of the kaleidoscope early on. It's about halfway through when he just takes over the book. And if you go back and look at Madame Bovary, which is all about Emma, I think it's 75 or 80 pages before Emma is introduced. There's a long wait for her to come in, and that's what I think of. I mean, I have a little bit of a Madame Bovary fetish. I mean, I think pretty much the ultimate answer to every question about the novel is always like it's in Madame Bovary. But I do think that there's something very sly and patient about doing that. And again, I can imagine it must have been hard to do, because if you know that this is where you're going as a storyteller, to delay it like that in order to catch the reader more by surprise is a very confident thing to do.
This one is from Don Sherrick, also of Massachusetts. How does the concept of ragtime music figure in the story, and why is the ragtime of music an important concept?
Well, I would never pose as any kind of expert, even a secular one, about music. But I think there's a few different things that are going on. One of them is it has to do with, it's contained in the book's epigraph about ragtime has to be played slowly. It's a mistake to play it too fast. I think we remember ragtime often. We think of it as a sort of jaunty, celebratory music. Most of it is not that. Most of it, and that's maybe because it's often played too fast, but that it's more melancholy than we remember it. And it's more melancholy than it might be if we weren't listening to it closely. And that spirit, I think, hovers over the book for sure. Which is that it's especially in the beginning, it seems like a lot of fun, but you got to slow down and consider it patiently, and it's actually deeper than that.
Jacqueline Schmidt of New York. How can this book's combination of fact and fiction get to the truth of a story, or in this case, an era, more than straightforward history?
Historical fiction, I mean, I don't even really want to limit it to historical fiction, but one of the reasons that stories convey something to people about the way we live now or the way we lived before that history doesn't is that it reframes the facts as personal issues in a way that gets you to feel them. And there's a difference between knowing something and feeling it. And I think that, whatever you may know about, I love another figure who comes up in the book is Jacob Riis, right? And I remember actually, Doctorow has a little fun with Jacob Riis. I remember, that book just blew my mind when I was in school. I had no idea. And it really blew the mind of the people who read it when it was first published. So it has an enormous impact. This is How the Other Half Lives is the book, which was a kind of expose of what life was like in the tenements of New York. There are facts and there are even photographs like Riis took, but then there is someone who through the power of their own imagination and empathy and through their adeptness with language can get you to kind of feel it from the inside, and there's no substitute for that. I guess there's another part of that question, which is this ragtime, of course, is not all fiction. It breaks down that wall to some extent and lets a lot of facts and legends and legendary people onto the stage along with the made up ones. And that's like, I guess that's a matter of taste in the end. I think it works. I think that if anytime, especially in any era, there are regular people, for lack of a better word, and there are people who live on the plane of kind of legend, of myth. And this was true even before there was such a thing as mass media. The larger than life figures of the early 20th century were part of the life of the early 20th century. I mean, I think to acknowledge, that there, I forget again what he calls Morgan pretty much like, more than a man. Like he lived on another plane entirely. Celebrities like Houdini, celebrities even like Evelyn Nesbit, who, it would be going too far to call Evelyn Nesbit a kind of proto Kardashian, but not that too far. They're part of what it meant to live then, and so to acknowledge that by bringing them onto the stage, I think that too is a way of getting at something that a straight up, plainly factual history probably couldn't get at.
Well, maybe that's a nice place to stop. Thank you so very much.
Oh, thank you. It was really a pleasure. I could talk about this book forever.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight for Tea Book Club, and a special thanks to Jonathan for sharing his insights. You can find his essay on Ragtime at tmagazine.com. If you'd like to continue the conversation, follow us on Twitter at @TMagazine and use the hashtag #TeaBookClub. The next title in the series is Jazz by Toni Morrison. You can RSVP to the virtual event, which will take place on October 27th on our website. We look forward to seeing you then.